To the unified consciousness of the Cygnus Hive, the universe was a symphony. Its name, when translated by the crude linguistic models of other species, was simply the Oneness. Its mind was the prime chorus, a single perfect song sung by trillions of voices across a dozen star systems. Every thought, every action, every life was a note, and every note was in perfect, harmonious accord. The purpose of the Oneness was simple: to expand this harmony. It traveled the void, seeking out dissonance, the chaotic, painful, screaming static of planets that suffered from the disease of individuality. It did not conquer, it healed. It found these worlds, these shrieking cacophonies of competing, solitary minds, and it gently, benevolently, brought them into its song. It was an act of ultimate compassion. Its arrival in the Sol system was, to the chorus, a moment of profound sadness. The third planet was not just dissonant. It was a maddening, agonizing, unending roar of noise. Where other primitive worlds had a few thousand competing mental frequencies, this one had billions. Billions of separate, frantic, and contradictory voices, all screaming at once in 1,000 different languages on 1,000,000 different broadcast frequencies, in a chaotic, overlapping, and utterly broken psychic scream. It was the most acute case of individuality the Oneness had ever encountered. It was a planet in a state of terminal, self-inflicted agony. The vessel that carried the Oneness's will was a perfect, obsidian ovoid, miles long, named the Conductor. It hung in high orbit, its presence undetectable to the primitive sensor arrays of the planet below. Aboard the Conductor, the being that served as the local, physical avatar of the Prime Chorus's will floated in a nutrient-rich suspension field. This being, the first voice of the pacification, analyzed the din. Its logic was flawless, built upon the experience of absorbing 100 other species. The strategy was always the same. A civilization, no matter how chaotic, always had a prime, dissonance, a central command structure, a unified voice that attempted to conduct the chaos. By silencing this single voice, the rest of the static would become disorganized, frightened, and easy to shepherd into the harmony of the chorus. The first voice listened, its vast collective mind sifting through the noise. It found the prime dissonance easily. It was a layered, hierarchical structure of military and political broadcasts, emanating from a few heavily shielded subterranean locations. This was the head of the beast, the lead screamer in the chorus of pain. The first voice would silence. It would be an act of mercy, a swift surgical strike that would end the planet's suffering and begin its true, harmonious life. It did not analyze the smaller, weaker signals, the chatter of local militias, the whispers of isolated individuals, the encoded messages of criminals, or the creative daydreams of lone thinkers. This was all just static, the inevitable, meaningless echo of the primary disease. Once the head was gone, the static would fade. This was the logic. It was perfect. It was time-tested. And it had never in 10,000 years of healing been wrong. The first voice gave the single, silent, unified command. The pacification of Earth had begun. General Eva Rostova was a woman made of concrete and coffee. Her home for the last 3 years had been the Aegis, a command bunker buried so deep beneath the Colorado Rockies that its inhabitants measured time in shift changes and air recycler cycles. The Aegis was the prime dissonance, the central nervous system of the Sol Defense Force, and the most secure military installation in human history. It was from this tomb of steel and quantum-entangled comms that Eva was attempting to coordinate a global response to the single massive unidentified object that had just parked itself in orbit. Every nation on Earth was represented on her main holographic display, their leaders' faces a gallery of barely controlled panic. "We have pinged it on every frequency from radio to gamma ray," Eva said, her voice a low, steady monotone that cut through the hysteria. "No response. We have sent hailing messages in every language, including pure binary and the hydrogen emission spectrum. Nothing. It is either unable or unwilling to talk." "So we shoot," barked a Russian general on the screen. "We send the Archangel Squadron. We hit it with everything we have." "Negative, General," Eva countered, pulling up a new data feed. The Archangel Squadron, along with the entire 7th Fleet, went dark 17 minutes ago. They were on an intercept course. They didn't fire a shot. They didn't launch a life pod. They just vanished from all sensors. A cold, heavy silence fell over the room and the faces on the screens. A single silent ship had just neutralized Earth's most advanced orbital defense fleet without a visible effort. This was not a first contact. This was an executioner arriving for his appointment. "My God," whispered the French ambassador. "What is it waiting for?" It wasn't waiting at all. The pacification pulse was not a missile. It was not a laser. It was a targeted, synchronous, planet-wide surge of pure, disruptive energy, aimed with surgical precision at every major node of human command. In the Aegis, the first sign was a faint, melodic thrum that seemed to come from the very air. "What is that?" an aide asked, his head tilted. "Unscheduled diagnostic?" Before Ava could respond, the thrum became a chord, a sound of impossible, beautiful, and devastating harmonic resonance. The main holographic display did not explode. It simply dissolved, its coherent light shattering into a cascade of harmless, glittering photons. The quantum-entangled comms, the pride of human technology, let out a single high-pitched ping and died. The delicate quantum states that bound them to the global network instantly decohered. The lights flickered, went red, and then, for the first time in the Aegis's 50-year history, they went out, plunging the world's most secure bunker into a terrifying, primitive darkness. "Backup power!" Rostova roared into the black, but she already knew. The backup generators, the triple redundant failsafes, the cold fusion cores, they were all tied to the same sophisticated, centralized command grid. And that grid was dead. The attack was not on their power, it was on their coordination. A young lieutenant fumbled with a chemical light stick, cracking it to life. Its sickly green glow illuminated a scene of profound technological death. The most powerful military command center on Earth, the brain of human resistance, had been reduced to a cave full of frightened people in the dark. Ava Rostova, general of the Unified Forces, was now just a woman in a concrete box, completely, totally, and perfectly blind. On the conductor, the first voice registered the successful silencing of the prime dissonance. The planet's chaotic, hierarchical scream had vanished. The head was severed. The war, according to all logic, was over. Now only the cleanup, the pacification, remained. Sarge Thorne, known to the 37 residents of Haven, Colorado as Sarge, was not a general. He was a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who now ran the local VFW hall, a small, dusty building that smelled of stale beer, old wood, and regret. He was halfway through a game of 8-ball with a plumber named Jax when the world ended. The small CRT television in the corner, which had been showing a panicked, blurry news report from Denver, suddenly hissed, popped, and went dark. A moment later, the entire town of Haven and the world with it was plunged into silence and darkness. The power was gone. Jax, cue in hand, just stared at the blank screen. "Solar flare?" he offered, his voice nervous. Sarge Thorne said nothing. He slowly, deliberately set his pool cue back in the rack. He walked over to the bar, poured himself a single, neat shot of whiskey, and drank it. He looked less like a man facing an apocalypse and more like a man who had just been told his truck needed a new transmission. "No," he said, setting the glass down with a heavy thud. "It's not a flare." He walked into the back room and unlocked a heavy steel locker. Inside was not just his old service rifle, but a shortwave hand-crank radio. He unfurled the antenna and began to turn the crank, the high-pitched whine filling the room as he spun the dial. He was met with nothing but static. No military broadcasts, no emergency frequencies, no civilian chatter, just the empty, dead hiss of the void. "They're gone," he whispered. "The whole damn grid. They did it. They finally did it." "Who did it?" "Sarge?" Jax asked, his voice now trembling. "And what do we do?" Sarge slung the radio over his shoulder and grabbed his rifle. "Who doesn't matter. What matters is the town. What matters is this street." He walked back into the bar. "Jax, you're a plumber." Go to the water tower, set the bypass to manual. We're on gravity feed as of now. He pointed to another man, a quiet history teacher named Ben. Ben, you hunt. Go to the hardware store, find Jed, get every box of rifle and shotgun ammunition he has, and all the propane tanks. Bring it all to the high school gym. That's our new rally point. The men who had been frozen in a state of civilian panic were suddenly galvanized. The prime dissonance of the global government was gone, but the micro-dissonance of a retired Marine gunny had just taken its place. Within an hour, the town of Haven was a flurry of organized, low-tech activity. Thorne wasn't trying to save the world. He was trying to hold his 3-block-long main street. He was not a general conducting a war. He was a homeowner, preparing for a home invasion. His militia was a collection of plumbers, electricians, hunters, and farmers. Their weapons were hunting rifles, shotguns, and a few illegally modified AR-15s. Their fortifications were Jax's backhoe digging a trench across the highway, and a series of jury-rigged explosives made from the propane tanks and gasoline siphoned from the dead cars. To the first voice orbiting above, the town of Haven did not even register as static. It was a statistical zero, a pocket of disorganized biological life that would be cleansed in due time. It had no power, no long-range communications, and no strategic value. It was, by all logical definitions, irrelevant. And that, as Sarge Thorne chambered around in his old rifle, was the most dangerous thing it could possibly be. Lena Petrova was a survivor of organized chaos. As a fourth-year chemical engineering student at a massive state university, her entire life was a battle against entropy, from the Byzantine class registration system to the Friday night chaos of the dorms. When the pacification pulse hit, she wasn't in a bunker or a bar. She was in the sub-basement of the chemistry building, finishing a late-night lab on catalyzed reactions. The pulse manifested as a high, pure note that made the Pyrex beakers on her bench sing. Then the lights went out, and the emergency generator failed to kick in. She was plunged into a perfect, chemical-scented darkness, her only light the faint, blue glow of the Bunsen burner she had been using. She grabbed her phone. It was a dead, warm piece of glass. Her laptop was the same. She was, for the first time in her life, utterly and completely disconnected. She grabbed her backpack, a heavy, overstuffed thing, and fumbled for the chemical flashlight in her emergency kit. She made her way up to the ground level and looked out onto the campus quad. It was a scene from a silent nightmare. The first wave of the Hive-Mind's ground troops, the Harmonics, had landed. They were tall, slender, chrome-like beings, moving in perfect, synchronized squads of 10. They moved like dancers, their steps perfectly in time, their heads all turning at the exact same instant. They were beautiful, and they were terrifying. They were ignoring the buildings. They were targeting the people. A crowd of panicked students had poured out of the main library, screaming, their phones held up as useless talismans. A squad of Harmonics flowed toward them, not with weapons, but with their hands raised. They began to sing, a low, resonant chord that was a physical orse. Lena watched in horror as the students simply stopped. Their panicked faces went slack, their eyes glazed over, and a look of profound, blissful peace settled on their features. They stood, unmoving, as the Harmonics gently herded them, like sheep, into a containment area. They were being absorbed into the chorus. Lena scrambled back, her heart hammering, her mind racing. She didn't see a monster. She saw a process. She ducked into a maintenance tunnel, her mind a finely tuned machine of logic and observation, analyzing what she had just seen. They were predictable. They moved in perfect, grid-like patterns. They responded to the loudest, targets first, the largest groups, the screaming individuals. They were a perfect, logical, and deeply stupid algorithm. She, a lone student, hiding in a tunnel, was beneath their notice. She was static. She was noise. She looked at her backpack, and a new, terrible, and creative idea began to form. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a general. But she was a very, very good chemist. She crept back down into the sub-basement. She left her useless laptop, her dead phone. She emptied her textbooks from her bag. She began with the precise, practiced hands of a scientist to fill it with something else. Potassium chlorate from the oxidizer cabinet, ammonium nitrate from the bulk fertilizer store, sulfur, sugar, aluminum filings. She found a box of old-fashioned match-head-activated igniters from a rocket propulsion display. She was not a warrior. She was a lone wolf, a single, unpredictable, and creative variable. And she was about to introduce the concept of improvised to a species that had never in its entire existence had a single original, non-harmonious thought. The pacification of Earth began in earnest. From the perfect obsidian ovoid of the conductor, 10,000 smaller teardrop-shaped landers descended, entering the atmosphere in a flawless, mathematically distributed pattern. They moved with the silent, serene grace of falling snow, their crystalline hulls untouched by the buffeting winds of the planet's chaotic atmosphere, which the Oneness was already beginning to find distasteful. Each lander carried a cohort of 100 harmonics, the physical ground-level avatars of the prime chorus. Their purpose was not to conquer, but to gather. Their mission was one of mercy. They were the shepherds who had come to collect the lost, screaming sheep and bring them into the fold. The first voice from its orbital throne watched the deployment with a sense of calm, benevolent certainty. The prime dissonance was a silenced drum, its frantic hierarchical beat gone from the psychic spectrum. All that remained was the cleanup, the gathering of the disorganized, terrified static that was the human population. The first voice's vast collective mind saw it all as a single, planetary-scale equation that was now, finally, resolving toward a harmonious solution. The harmonics disembarked in every major population center on the planet. In the rain-slick streets of London, cohorts moved in perfect 10 by 10 squares, their chrome-like bodies shimmering in the gloom of the dead city. They did not carry weapons. Their presence was their function. They found the survivors huddled, in the underground, in the basements of apartment buildings, in the cold, dark shells of their abandoned vehicles. The humans were terrified, their individual minds projecting a high-pitched, painful shriek of fear and confusion. The harmonics did what they were designed to do. They began to sing. The sound was a low, resonant chord, a wave of pure, acoustic empathy. It was a promise of an end to fear, an end to loneliness, an end to the agonizing burden of the self. The huddled masses of survivors felt the sound wash over them. The terror in their minds was not ignored. It was answered. The song promised them that their pain was understood, and that it could be taken away, dissolved into a warm, loving, infinite ocean of a million other voices. One by one, the survivors stood, their panicked faces relaxing, their eyes glazing over with a look of profound, ecstatic peace. The harmonics gently guided the new, placid members of the chorus into the open, to be catalogued and prepared for integration. The same scene was repeated in the flooded ruins of Mumbai, the frozen streets of Moscow, and the empty sun-baked canyons of Los Angeles. The process was efficient, predictable, and overwhelmingly successful. The first voice's analysis of the human psyche had been perfect. They were a species pathologically terrified of being alone. Their entire civilization, a complex, noisy, and ultimately failed attempt to build a connection that their biology denied them. The Oneness was not taking anything from them. It was giving them the one thing they had always craved, true unity. There were, of course, anomalies. The logic core registered thousands of small pockets of static that were not immediately resolved. These were the hardcore dissonances, individuals whose minds were so pathologically isolated, so wrapped in layers of cynicism or trauma, that the chorus's song could not immediately find purchase. They were hiders, lone wolves, minds that registered as tight, painful knots of pure negative static. The first voice was not concerned. This was a predicted phase of the healing. These knots would be dealt with individually. They were statistically insignificant, the last stubborn embers of a fire that was already extinguished. The Oneness had no algorithm for organized, decentralized, and malicious defiance. It had an algorithm for pacification, for benevolence, for absorption. It had no framework for a species that would, upon being offered heaven, choose to spit in its face and build a bomb. In Haven, Colorado, the high school gym had become a fortress. Sarge Thorne's militia, which now numbered nearly 80, men and women, had worked with a frantic, focused energy. Jax the plumber had successfully bypassed the town's water grid, ensuring a steady supply from the reservoir. Ben, the history teacher, a surprisingly good shot, had organized the town's hunters into 5-man hunter-killer teams, arming them with every high-caliber rifle in a 50-mile radius. The windows of the gym were barricaded with sandbags filled with dirt from the baseball field. The main highway, the only logical approach to the town, was now a carefully prepared kill zone. The propane tank IEDs buried just beneath the asphalt, their triggers run back to a manual detonator in the gymnasium's press box. Thorne stood, by the main entrance, an old pair of military binoculars to his eyes, scanning the road. He had spent his entire career fighting humans. He knew how they thought, how they flanked, how they suppressed, how they broke. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived 3 tours in hostile territory, that you never, ever let the enemy set the terms of the engagement. They arrived on the second day, exactly as Thorne had predicted, walking straight down the middle of the highway. It was a single cohort, 100 chrome-bodied harmonics moving in a perfect 10 by 10 grid, their steps so synchronized it was unnerving. They did not take cover. They did not scan for threats. They were simply arriving. They were beautiful, impossible, and utterly contemptuous. "Hold." Thorne's voice was a low growl over the walkie-talkie network they had salvaged. "Hold your fire. Wait for the box." The harmonics advanced, their movements a fluid, elegant dance. They reached the edge of the kill zone, the buried propane tanks just meters ahead. They stopped. And then they began to sing. It was the same chord that had pacified London, the same wave of acoustic empathy and love. It washed over the high school, a sound so pure and beautiful that it made the teeth of the defenders ache. Men gripped their rifles, their knuckles white, as a sudden, overwhelming, and deeply unwanted sense of peace and belonging tried to claw its way into their minds. They felt their anger, their fear, their very sense of self begin to dissolve. "Now, Jax," Thorne roared, his own mind fighting the seductive psychic pull of the song. In the press box, Jax, tears of a strange, ecstatic joy streaming down his face, slammed his hand down on the detonator. The highway erupted. 5 propane tank IEDs, enhanced with gasoline and bags of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, detonated simultaneously. It was not a precision strike. It was a dirty, brutal, concussive wave of fire, shrapnel, and pure chemical force. The front 3 ranks of the harmonic cohort, 30 perfect, chrome-like beings, were not just killed. They were annihilated, their bodies instantly vaporized, shattered, and torn apart by a blast of primitive, chaotic, human-made hell. The song stopped. The remaining 70 harmonics froze, their perfect unified grid broken, their program disrupted. They had no protocol for this. They had no algorithm for sudden, violent, organized resistance from a source of static. They simply stood there in the fire and the smoke as if waiting for new instructions. "Fire!" Thorne bellowed. The gym's windows exploded outward as every rifle in the building opened up at once. It was not the panicked, sporadic fire of a terrified mob. It was the disciplined, rhythmic crackle of hunters. High-caliber rounds designed to take down deer and elk slammed into the chrome bodies. The harmonics, built for elegance, not for kinetic warfare, crumpled, their bodies shattering like glass, their limbs torn from their torsos. They did not scream. They did not take cover. They simply stood, confused as the static tore them to pieces. In less than 2 minutes, the entire cohort was a field of glittering broken scrap. In the silence that followed, a single, stunned voice came over the walkie-talkie. "Sarge, what the hell was that?" Thorne lowered his binoculars, his heart hammering, but his voice was cold as ice. "That," he said, was round one. Jax, get the backhoe. We're building a new kill zone. Lena Petrova was a ghost in her own city. For 48 hours she had moved through the maintenance tunnels and steam pipes of the university, her world a map of shadows and muffled sounds. She had watched the harmonics' predictable, grid-like patrols. She had seen their pacification process up close, the way they never used violence, only the overwhelming, seductive power of their song. She had also seen what happened when that song failed. A lone, feral dog, its mind too simple or perhaps too pure to be harmonized, had charged a harmonic squad. The aliens had simply stopped, confused, their song wavering as they tried to find a frequency that would pacify the animal. The dog had torn a piece of shimmering metallic flesh from one of their legs before they had simply, gently, enclosed it in a kinetic field, a bubble of pure force, and held it, unharmed, in a state of confused stasis. They were benevolent, they were powerful, and they were, she concluded, absolute idiots. Their entire operating system was built on a single binary premise. You were either a mind to be healed or an anomaly to be contained. They had no protocol for a mind that intended to hurt them. She had prepared her gift. It was not a simple bomb. It was a chemical reaction, a statement of malicious applied science. She had borrowed several large pressurized canisters of chlorine gas from the campus water treatment facility. She had combined this with a significant quantity of calcium carbide from the geology department's labs, and a simple, battery-powered detonator rigged to a model rocket igniter. Her target was the central courtyard, the place where the harmonics were bringing their placid, newly harmonized flock. They had set up a temporary energy beacon there, a glowing crystalline pylon that pulsed in time with their song, and it was guarded by a cohort of 50 harmonics, all standing in a perfect, serene circle. From a fourth-floor chemistry lab window, she watched. The harmonics were focused on their task, their collective mind a single harmonious note. She took a deep breath, her own mind a tight, cold knot of electrochemical equations, and triggered the device. The first stage was the explosion of the carbide, which, when mixed with water from the courtyard's fountain, instantly generated a massive roiling cloud of acetylene gas. The second stage, a split second later, was the ignition. The resulting fuel-air explosion was catastrophic, a concussive, deafening whump that sent a fireball 200 feet into the air. The crystalline pylon and the 50 harmonics guarding it were instantly incinerated. But that was just the appetizer. The heat from the explosion then breached the chlorine canisters. A heavy, toxic, greenish-yellow cloud of pure, suffocating poison gas rolled outward, enveloping the entire courtyard and the hundreds of newly pacified, unmoving humans who were standing there, waiting for their salvation. Lena watched, her face a cold, impassive mask, as the harmonics who had survived the initial blast were enveloped by the gas. The effect was immediate. Their song, the beautiful, psychic chord, turned into a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of pure, physical pain. Their chrome-like skin, a miracle of alien biology, began to corrode and dissolve. Their respiratory systems, whatever they were, choked on the poison. But they did not flee. They did not attack. They simply stood there, clutching their dissolving throats, their perfect logical minds utterly unable to process a threat that was not psychic, not kinetic, but chemical. They were trying to harmonize with the chlorine, to find a frequency that would make the pain stop. They died, melting into puddles of metallic sludge, their final dying note, a question of pure, uncomprehending confusion. Lena shouldered her empty backpack. She felt no remorse, no horror, no triumph. It was just an equation. They had applied a variable. She had applied a counter-variable. She was a single, dissonant note, and she had just proven she had sharper teeth than their entire harmonious choir. The first voice's meditative suspension was broken by a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. For the first time in its millennia-long existence, the prime chorus, the single unified song of trillions of voices, faltered. It was a jarring, discordant, and agonizing sensation. Two notes, two individual, piercing screams of pure psychic death, had just been torn from the symphony. Two entire cohorts, one in a small irrelevant mountain town, one in a minor educational center, had been simultaneously and violently silenced. The first voice's avatar convulsed in its nutrient bath, its vast mind struggling to process the impossible contradictory data. The prime dissonance was gone. The head was severed. The war was over. Why, then, was the static screaming back? The holographic displays in the conductor's bridge flared to life, replaying the final corrupted sensor data from the two lost cohorts. The images were a nightmare of illogical chaos. In one feed, the first voice saw its perfect, beautiful harmonics, its shepherds being torn to shreds by primitive high-velocity metal slugs, their bodies shattered by a crude chemical explosion. In the other, it saw its healers melting, their very substance dissolved by a cloud of corrosive gas, their final moments a symphony of pain. This was not the gentle fading of disorganized static. This was not the confused thrashing of a frightened, dying animal. This was tactics. This was malice. This was weaponized individuality. The first voice, in its cold, logical benevolence, had made a catastrophic error in judgment. It had assumed that by decapitating the centralized hierarchical command structure, the prime dissonance of the human species, that the rest of the body would die. It had failed to understand the most fundamental, most terrifying truth of human consciousness. It was not a hierarchy. It was a network. It was a chaotic, redundant, and infinitely adaptive system. When the first voice had cut off the head, it had not killed the beast. It had simply and fatally forced the beast to evolve. It had destroyed the single, unified general and, in its place, 1,000 new generals had been born. A retired soldier in a bar, a chemistry student in a lab, a farmer with a rifle, a mother defending her home. The Oneness was no longer fighting a single, predictable war against a unified army. It was now fighting 1,000,000 tiny individual wars, on 1,000,000 different fronts against 1,000,000 different strategies. The planet was not a single screaming patient. It was a swarm of hornets, and the hive had just kicked the nest. The first voice, its logic shattered, its entire doctrine of benevolent pacification now a proven failure, was forced to confront a new, terrible truth. The healing was over. The dissonance, the static, the noise, was not a symptom of a disease. It was the enemy, and the war, the real, ugly, chaotic, and unwinnable war, had only just begun. The first voice, in its orbital sanctuary, was experiencing a new, deeply unsettling sensation. It was not pain, for which it had an algorithm of benevolent neutralization. It was failure, a logical, systemic, and catastrophic failure of its core premise. The prime chorus, the perfect unified song of trillions of minds, was now tainted with the psychic screams of its own dying avatars and the jagged, hateful static of an enemy that refused to be healed. The data from Haven and the university was not just an anomaly, it was a refutation. The first voice had attempted to silence a single hierarchical drumbeat, and in doing so, had awakened 1,000,000 asynchronous, polyrhythmic, and utterly malicious war drums. The benevolent shepherd had discovered that the sheep were, in fact, a decentralized, infinitely replicating pack of rabid wolves. Logic demanded a new approach. The old doctrine, pacification by harmony, was deleted, its core axioms now proven false. A new doctrine, cold, hard, and built on the brutal evidence of the past 2 days, was compiled. It was the doctrine of sterilization. If the static would not be harmonized, it would be silenced. If the dissonance would not join the song, it would be erased. The fundamental error had been one of benevolence. The Oneness had dispatched harmonics, shepherds, healers, and guides. They were avatars of empathy, their bodies designed to soothe, not to withstand kinetic assault. They were instruments of peace, and they had been sent into a charnel house. The first voice, its vast mind now focused on a new grim purpose, initiated the next phase. It began to build. Deep within the conductor, in the vast, silent fabrication bays that had been intended to build new sonic temples and integration hubs, the molecular forges roared to life. They were no longer crafting the slender, elegant harmonics. They were crafting suppressors. These new avatars were not beautiful. They were brutalist, 8-foot-tall machines of war. Their chrome-like, elegant skin was replaced with thick, ablative, carbide-laced armor, designed not to resonate, but to absorb and deflect the crude kinetic impacts of the humans' primitive chemical weapons. Their hands, once designed to gently guide the pacified, were now heavy, multi-barreled plasma casters, a technology the Hive had long held in reserve, deeming it unnecessarily loud for a healing. Their minds were not the open, empathetic chorus of the harmonics. They were a cold, narrow-band frequency, a single repeated note of pure, focused obedience. Find the static. Erase the static. The First Voice's strategy shifted from a planet-wide gathering to a targeted, surgical extermination. Its vast sensor array, which had previously ignored the low-level noise, now began to actively hunt for it. It pinpointed the sources of concentrated, organized dissonance, a signal from a hand-crank radio in the Colorado mountains, a series of chemical explosions on the East Coast, a pocket of armed resistance in the sewers of Old Berlin, a fishing trawler in the North Atlantic, its old illegal radio broadcasting defiant, angry messages. These were the static nodes, the new prime dissonances. They were cancers. And the suppressors were the scalpel, the chemotherapy, and the radiation, all rolled into one. The First Voice, in its shift from benevolent God to exterminating, angel had just made its second and far more fatal mistake. It had acknowledged the static as an enemy. It had, for the first time, given the doctrine of many a power it could not comprehend. Legitimacy. It had admitted that the static mattered. Sarge Thorne was a man who understood the value of a good story. In the aftermath of the Highway Massacre, as the town was already calling it, Haven had become a grim, fortified island in a sea of silence. Thorne knew their victory was a fluke, a one-time trick that wouldn't work again. The enemy, whatever it was logical. It had learned. It would be back, and next time, it would be ready. He knew he couldn't save his town, not in the long run, not alone. But he could, perhaps, save his species. He went back to the high school, to the dusty, disused office of the student radio station. The hand-crank radio was his lifeline to the outside world, but it was only for listening. The school's old analog high-frequency transmitter was a megaphone. It was a massive, antiquated beast of vacuum tubes and thick copper wiring, a relic from an age before satellites, and it was, blessedly, completely immune to the pacification pulse. It had its own dedicated diesel generator. He fired it up. The sound of the generator roaring to life was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, a defiant mechanical fuck you to the silent alien god in the sky. He grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white. He didn't know who, if anyone, was listening. He didn't care. He began to broadcast. This is Sergeant Sarge Thorne, retired, United States Marine Corps, broadcasting from Haven, Colorado. If you can hear me, the war is not over. I repeat, the war is not over. He didn't waste time on hope or prayers or calls for a centralized resistance. He knew, instinctively, that centralization was what had gotten them killed. He gave them the only thing he had, the truth. The enemy is logical. They are predictable. They move in grids. They will not adapt to chaotic force. They are shepherds. They are soft. We hit a cohort of 100 with 5 propane IEDs and high-caliber rifle fire. We sustained 0 casualties. They sustained 100%. They are not gods. They are glass. He spent the next hour detailing his tactics. He explained the kill zone, the trigger mechanism, the precise, disciplined nature of the volley fire that had broken them. Do not engage them in the open. Do not try to reason with them. They are not here to talk. They are here to absorb you. Fight small, fight alone, fight in groups of 2 and 3. Be the static they can't tune out. Be the noise. Be the dissonance. He repeated his broadcast every hour, on the hour, changing frequencies, sending his desperate, angry sermon out into the dead, silent air. He was a single, stubborn voice, A new prime dissonance who didn't even know he was the new general of a global phantom army. Hundreds of miles away, in her chemical-stained fortified lab, Lena Petrova was sweeping the shortwave bands on, a receiver she had cobbled together from a vintage ham radio. She was listening for anything, any sign of life. And then she heard it. The voice of the old soldier. A thrill, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. He wasn't just alive. He was teaching. He was giving a lecture, and the subject was applied mayhem. She began to take notes, her brilliant, chaotic mind cross-referencing his kinetic tactics with her own chemical ones. In the Aegis bunker, General Rostova, her world reduced to a single copper-wired hardline to the Cheyenne Mountain complex, heard the broadcast relayed from a NORAD sensor station that had picked up the high-frequency spike. "Get me a trace on that signal," she commanded. "Find out who that is." But more importantly, she listened. She was a general without an army, a head without a body, and she had just heard the first defiant heartbeat of 1,000 new bodies. The old hierarchical structure was dead. The new one, the doctrine of many, was being born, its first gospel broadcast by an angry man in a high school radio booth. The assault on Haven was a symphony of overwhelming logical force. The first voice, having pinpointed Thorne's broadcast as a primary node of the new decentralized infection, was not taking any more chances. It did not send a single cohort. It sent a battalion. 500 suppressor units, the new armored weaponized avatars, descended on the small mountain town. They did not walk down the highway. They advanced in a perfect, sweeping, multi-pronged formation. One pincer group moving through the dense forest to the north, another scaling the sheer rock face to the south, while the main body advanced on the highway, their thick carbide armor impervious to the small arms fire of the town's snipers. Thorne had been right. The enemy had learned. The battle was a massacre. The propane IEDs that had shattered the unarmored harmonics now only staggered the suppressors, their ablative armor shrugging off the shrapnel. The high-caliber rounds of the Hunters, which had torn through the chrome bodies, now sparked and ricocheted off the dense plating. In return, the suppressors unleashed their plasma casters. The high school gym, the human fortress, was methodically deconstructed. Plasma bolts tore through the sandbagged windows, turning the gym floor into a burning, molten pit. The defenders, for all their courage, were being exterminated. They were fighting tanks with hunting rifles, and the math was no longer on their side. "Fall back!" Thorne roared, his voice thick with the smoke and the stench of ozone. "Fall back to the mines! Secondary rally point! Go! Go!" He was no longer a general. He was a shepherd himself, trying to get his flock to safety. But the first voice had anticipated this too. Its logic was relentless. The main highway bridge, the only escape route from the town, was now held by a fresh cohort of suppressors who had landed just minutes before. The citizens of Haven, the first spark of the human resistance, were trapped in a perfectly executed, logical pincer movement. They were about to be systematically and efficiently erased. But the first voice's logic, for all its perfection, had failed to account for a new, chaotic variable. It had analyzed Thorne. It had not analyzed his audience. As the suppressor cohort on the bridge advanced to close the trap, a single, battered, bright yellow school bus, its engine roaring, came barreling down the mountain road from the opposite direction. Lena Petrova, her face smeared with soot, a wild, terrifying grin on her face, was at the wheel. She had been driving for 36 hours, following the radio signal, her bus loaded not with children, but with 1,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, 50 gallons of diesel fuel, and a very large, very unstable battery-triggered detonator. She had seen the new armored aliens. She had seen the pincer movement. She was a chemist. And she knew that if a problem was too big to solve, you introduced a new, much bigger, much more exothermic reaction. She aimed the bus at the center of the bridge, right at the feet of the advancing suppressor cohort. She lit the 5-second fuse, opened the door, and at 60 miles an hour, she jumped. She hit the rocky embankment and rolled, the gravel tearing her jacket just as the bus slammed into the lead suppressor. The resulting fuel-air explosion was not a tactical strike. It was a geological event. The ANFO bomb, a weapon of pure, brute force chemistry, detonated with the force of a small tactical nuke. The entire multi-ton concrete and steel bridge was not just damaged. It was vaporized, a massive section of it simply ceasing to be. The suppressor cohort and the pincer they represented were gone, their constituent atoms scattered across the canyon. The explosion, a deafening, chaotic, and utterly beautiful roar of pure, human-made hell, was the signal. From her bunker, General Rostova, who had been coordinating with Lena and a dozen other static nodes, gave her own silent order. All across the continent, at the precise moment of the Haven assault, a dozen other, smaller militia cells, hearing Thorne's desperate final stand on the radio, executed their own suicidal, chaotic attacks. They struck power relays, transport hubs, and landing zones. They were disorganized, small, and tactically insignificant. But they were simultaneous. The First Voice's vast, logical mind was suddenly flooded with a dozen new, critical threats. At the exact same moment it was trying to process the impossible, chemical annihilation of its primary flanking force. Its perfect, singular focus was shattered. It was being swarmed, not by a single physical army, but by 1,000 tiny, individual, and deeply malicious ideas. The First Voice was dying. It did not know this, as it had no concept of death, but it was experiencing a cascade of logical contradictions that were, in effect, the same thing. The sensory input from the planet below was no longer a solvable equation, it was a paradox. The simultaneous multi-vector attacks, all improvised, all illogical, all fueled by a different contradictory human emotion, were a form of data it could not process. The attack on Haven, which should have been a simple surgical sterilization, had failed. The target, Sarge Thorne, had escaped into the mine shafts, his broadcast now a triumphant, screaming testament to the power of improvised explosives and bad chemistry. The cost in suppressor units was catastrophic, but the physical loss was not the problem. The logical loss was. The First Voice, in its attempt to understand the new chaotic doctrine of its enemy, tried to integrate it. It tried to find the pattern in the chaos. It tried to harmonize with the doctrine of many, and that is when the virus truly took hold. It tried to process Sarge Thorne's grim, fatalistic, duty-bound logic. It tried to process Lena Petrova's gleeful, chaotic, creative, destructive logic. It tried to process the cold, strategic chessmaster logic of General Rostova, and it tried to process them all at the same time as a single, unified strategy. It was impossible. A mind built on the premise of a single, perfect, harmonious oneness was trying to absorb the concept of a million, successful, competing ones. The prime chorus, the single beautiful song of the Hive-Mind, began to fracture. The First Voice's vast consciousness, the gestalt of trillions, splintered. For the first time in its existence, it experienced a new, terrifying, and agonizing sensation. It had a single, solitary, independent thought. The thought was a dagger. I am failing. I am confused. I am afraid. The concept of I was a poison. It was the very disease it had come to heal, and it was now rampant within its own mind. The oneness was no longer one, it was becoming many. The prime chorus was collapsing into a screaming, terrified, contradictory cacophony of individual newborn minds all trapped in the same skull. The god was going insane. The conductor, the perfect obsidian ovoid in orbit, began to shudder. The First Voice, in its final lucid act of perfect, cold logic, recognized the contagion. It recognized that the planet below, this hell of static and individuality, was not just a military threat. It was a philosophical plague. It was an idea so virulent that it could destroy a god. The First Voice made its last, logical, and only possible choice. It initiated a cascade failure of its own vessel's containment core. The healing had failed. The sterilization had failed. The only option left was self-quarantine. On the surface of Earth, the survivors of Haven huddled at the mouth of the old, mine, watched as a new, silent, beautiful star bloomed in the night sky. The conductor, the benevolent, murderous, and logical god that had tried to save them, had annihilated itself, a final, perfect note of self-sacrifice to protect the rest of its own chorus from the terrible, beautiful, and incurable disease that was humanity. The war was over. The silence that fell over the planet was no longer the silence of oppression. It was the silence of a species, shattered, broken, and reduced to almost nothing. But for the first time in its history, truly and terrifyingly united in its absolute chaotic and indomitable individuality. The doctrine of many had won,